got to examine your cybersecurity at the physical level and at the online level, at the data security level. Do each of those things and make sure you're taking what are reasonable steps to protect the private information of people with whom you deal.
Welcome to another episode of A Little Privacy, Please. I'm Jenny Holmes. I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Jason Kravitz. Together, we lead NP's cybersecurity and privacy practice, and we are the co-hosts of this video series. Our guest today is none other than Chris Mason. Among many notable representations, Chris represented a data company in the largest consumer class action in history, with over 200 million class members and minimum statutory damages of $500 billion to $1 trillion. Chris is an active member of our privacy and cybersecurity team and is seemingly always up to date on the latest trends and technology. Always armed with relative anecdotes or history lessons, there is never a dull moment when Chris Mason is involved. And today will be no different as we discuss the New York Shield Act. So Chris, start us off. What is the New York Shield Act?
The New York Shield Act is the Stop Hacks and Improve Electronic Data Privacy Act. And it's been in effect for a number of years in New York. And it's our basic breach statute. It involves a situation whenever there's a breach of personal information by a company, the act requires that people be given notice of it in most instances. And there are penalties if companies don't give notice, and there are penalties if companies don't have adequate protections to prevent breaches of personal and private information. The act is different than that in some other states because it is uniquely for our Attorney General. It does not have a private right of action. So it's not, for example, like California's CCPA. And you'll think that's a good thing, and it is on average, but I just have to warn you that that doesn't mean that there are not private lawsuits in New York that are sometimes based on that act.
So, Chris, it sounds like the New York Shield Act is more of a cybersecurity act than it is a data privacy act. I mean, is that fair to say? It's not really New York's analog for the CCPA or the European Union's GDPR?
Yeah, New York doesn't really have an analog of that kind. New York's been considering a general purpose privacy act for a number of years. It hasn't passed it yet. So we have instead a whole plethora of little bits and pieces of laws in New York instead of a general purpose law. To that extent, I think you're right, Jason. The problem, of course, is once New York passes a law on anything, it generally thinks it's done everything there ever needs to be done and then doesn't do anything for a century more, which is why we have the Shield Act the way we do and why it's not a general purpose statute like the CCPA.
So Chris, who should be aware of this regulation and what happens if someone doesn't comply with it?
Every business in New York needs to be aware of the regulation and not-for-profit entities as well. What happens is if you have a breach and you don't respond to it appropriately, and the good thing is there's a mechanism in the Attorney General's website for doing reporting. If you don't do that correctly, though, you're going to be subject to sanctions that can range from a few dollars up to $250,000. And in addition, if you have, either because the breach reveals it or because you just haven't done it, if you don't have adequate security for personal and private information, then you're going to get a fine that could be up to $5,000 per instance of violation.
Are you saying, Chris, that every organization that collects personal information about New York residents is obligated to comply with this act?
Now, there's some exceptions here. Small companies, 50 employees or fewer, and there's some size limitations in terms of revenue, $3 million in revenue or $5 million in assets. They're exempt from the specifics of the act, but they still have to try to protect personal information. So, that's nice. In addition, if you're already compliant with HIPAA or you comply with certain other laws, if you're deemed to be compliant with them, then you get an exemption from separate compliance with the Shield Act. It doesn't really change anything. Those laws are going to have the same basic requirements, but it's just useful to know. You're right to say the word residents. Jason, that's very smart of you to indicate. It's not about companies in New York. It's about companies that have information about New Yorkers. So you have instances all the time where there's problems with this act, where there'll be a breach and only a small number of people in the breach will actually be New Yorkers, yet the act will apply.
Chris, if I'm recalling correctly, we had this big buildup to the Shields Act effective date back in March 2020. And then, of course, the pandemic happened and no one really heard about the SHIELD Act for quite some time. Now been over 3 years. Have there been any enforcement actions?
But yes, there definitely have been a number of fairly large cases. The law has been applied to internet companies. It's been applied to law firms. There's been a law firm case where the law firm ended up paying a couple of $100,000. So it's really is something that's out there and is being pursued.
Is there maybe one thing that you can recommend that a New York business should do in order to try and comply with it?
What you really have to do, unfortunately, is you've got to examine your cybersecurity at the physical level and at the online level, at the data security level. Do each of those things and make sure you're taking what are reasonable steps to protect the private information of people with whom you deal.
Chris, thanks for taking a little bit of time out to speak with us today about the New York SHIELD Act. We appreciate it.
It's been great, Jason. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks. And that's this episode of A Little Privacy, Please. Join us next time.
And favorite song that you sing in the car when you're driving alone, Chris?
I'm not telling you that.